Today is a big day here in the apiary. It's the 5th of October. It's a nice warm day here. The high is going to be about 80 degrees, and that gives a perfect opportunity to do my final checks of the hives before winter comes, make sure everybody's in good shape for winter, and also to harvest any excess honey they have. In the Layens hives, the general standard for preparing for winter and leaving enough honey for the bees to get through winter is to have about a 3 to 5 inch band of honey at the top of each of the brood frames. That's where the bees will cluster over winter, and during winter they'll work their way vertically and consume that honey that's left. And then I want to leave a full frame of honey on each end of those, and that is the honey that the bees will use when spring comes and they don't yet have enough nectar coming in from blooming flowers, but they still need to start producing brood. So that's what I'm going to leave for the bees, and anything they have beyond that we'll be taking and harvesting today. Let's get into it and steal some honey. I'm starting today in this small 12 frame hive, which was the home of my mother colony until that colony swarmed. And so the colony that's in here now is bees that remained behind along with the queen that they made. So it's a daughter queen to my original mother queen. All I plan to do is look at the ends, work my way back until I get to the brood frames, leave one full frame of honey and take what's left. And then I'll come back to the other end, try to pry out these end frames and do the same thing. If there's more than one full frame of honey, I'll take those and then leave the rest. As long as I can see the ends of the brood frames and see that there is good honey at the top, that's all I'm really concerned about. And at the same time, I'm going to condense these hives back. So frames like this that are pretty much empty, we will just take out so they don't have additional space in the hive that they have to work with. They've got tons of small hive beetles in here. That is not good. Usually you'll see the bees will kind of corral the small hive beetles, but they are just all over that frame. But they don't have the frame slimed, and I don't see any larvae. This next frame is heavier. They've got more honey there and some wet nectar. This may be a good frame to leave for them instead of harvesting. This frame also has a lot of wet nectar and not nearly the amount of beetles on these inner frames as we saw on that outer one. So they are kind of keeping those beetles pushed to the outside. So it looks like on these frames, now this one has a few brood cells there, but otherwise they are backfilling nectar on that frame. A little more brood on this side. So here at the top, there's quite a bit of capped brood on there. So now we're into the brood frames there. And now I'll just check on this other end. And by pulling out the excess frames here too, that'll give them less space to have to defend against things like those hive beetles. It's a very light frame, not really anything stored up on it. There are some beetles on there. Right, this frame is pretty much all honey, both wet nectar and honey. So they still have some drying to do on that. The bees have been surprisingly busy lately for it coming to the end of the season, which is great to see, but they still have quite a bit of nectar there to be dried. This hive has not been fed, so that is not sugar syrup, it's just nectar that the bees haven't yet dried. And they've got quite a bit of capped brood on that frame. We've got brood all the way to the bottom. Got about 3 inches and 2 to 3 inches of nectar at the top, but they've got quite a bit of nectar stored throughout here. On the back side of this frame, it's about the same story with that capped brood. So we've got that frame that's full of nectar. We'll leave it on the end. Brood frame there, brood frame here. Lots of nice winter brood there. See some bees trotting around with pollen on their legs. So we'll just put this back together, leaving them a fairly small space, maybe about 6 frames, which last winter I had 5 colonies, 5 out of 6 colonies survived through winter. And of those 5 surviving colonies, 4 of them were on 5 frames. So if I can leave these bees 6 frames, I know that's going to be plenty. This is a nice heavy honey frame. And this last frame, I could take this just based on how much they have in here, but because the amount of wet nectar in here, I think I may just leave this for the bees, let them dry that. I'd like to see about 80% of the frame capped, and this is only about 50%. So I'm just going to leave that one. Now this last frame has a little bit of honey on it. There's not much wet nectar in there, so this is probably a pretty good one for me to go ahead and take. So that leaves the bees with 6 frames. That's the state of this hive. They got a good population of bees as they are, and lots of capped brood that's going to be emerging before winter. So they should have a good population of winter bees. We got 1 harvestable frame, not a full frame, but we'll get some honey out of that. and pulled a couple frames out, give these bees a smaller consolidated space for winter, and I think they're good to go. Let's move on to the next hive. So now I'm moving on to the green hive. This hive has a colony that is a granddaughter colony of my original mother colony. I did a split of this colony this year, and the colony that was in here, which was the daughter colony, or an F1 from the mother colony, they went to another hive, which is our under the sea hive, and I'll be looking at that in a minute. That colony is doing fantastic. This colony also has done really well this year. They're on what, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15 frames right now, and that's pretty good. Didn't fill out a full 20. But I did notice when we got our drought and heat wave, honey production kind of shut down. So not too surprised that they didn't fill out further, although they were going fantastic this spring. So we'll see what they've got. I don't have quite the population of bees in here as I have seen previously. Usually I open the lid and the open space is full of bees, and there's bees up on top here to greet me, and not really seeing that today. But there has been a ton of activity at the entrance, so this doesn't concern me. It could just be natural drawback for this time of year. So this first frame has some hive beetles on there, just like we saw in the other hive. They do not have this frame slimed, but they're certainly crawling around on there, so we'll be chasing them off. And what we have of comb on here is full of honey on both sides, but not a lot. So this will probably be a frame that I'll be taking with me. This hive had a comb collapse earlier this year, and that also cost us some honey because the bees had to clean up that comb that had collapsed and the honey that was in it. And because it's the fullest honey frames that would collapse because of the weight of the honey on that comb, then of course we lost all that honey. The bees had to use that to rebuild comb and so on. This one's kind of unusual. It looks like it must have collapsed out of the middle there. I think that's what happened, and so they've just got these streaks of honey down through here. Down here they do have some nectar, wet nectar in there, which makes up a pretty good amount of the nectar that's in this frame, so I may not take this frame. I'm going to turn this just a second and see how quickly that nectar drips out. It's not dripping out very rapidly, so it's maybe fairly low moisture, and it looks like they have kind of started to cap some of that, so it may be harvestable. My first priority is to leave enough for the bees. Here's another honey frame, honey at the top, got wet nectar down through there. Same story on the other side. Now we're getting into more of the population center here. This frame obviously was a victim of collapse. I think we saw this on a previous inspection. And they've got good honey at the top, a lot of wet nectar stored up here in these cells. And even storing some honey down here at the bottom. And same story on this other side. Now this frame has some heft to it. They got lots of these frames, about half nectar, half honey. But now even down here at the bottom where they have this nectar, they're kind of capping off some of these cells. So this is fairly dry for nectar, but even at that, with about 50% uncapped, I'd be a little nervous about taking that frame. So these bees may know what they're doing, may buy themselves some extra honey frames by leaving some of that uncapped. And this one, again, a lot of nectar on that frame all the way down. Capped at the top, nice capping at the top, and then nectar all the rest of the way through. And same story on this side. So we've seen a lot of nectar and honey in this hive so far. Haven't yet gotten into the brood. We'll see this next frame. And one more. These guys have so many frames of half nectar, half honey. Kind of surprised they don't have this more of this capped by now. And again, this is a hive that, like the majority of my hives, and in fact all of my Layens hives right now, with the exception of one resource hive, I don't feed. So this is all nectar that they have brought in fairly recently. And we're probably now getting into these brood frames that they have started backfilling with nectar there. But over and over again, there we go, we got some capped brood through there. We're kind of out of those just honey frames, but they do have a good band. Capped honey ends right about there on that frame, so they've got a good band of honey there. Not as much capped brood on this other side. They've actually backfilled it with nectar, just preparations for winter. So we've got our brood starting about there. I'm not going to open up, well, I don't plan to open up all of these frames. We'll just come to the other end, and they got brood there. Let's make sure they have a honey frame on this other end. Starting to bump me in the veil here to let me know that they don't really want me here. But I just want to check and make sure they've got good honey on this end. Alright, and that's a full frame of honey there, nectar at the bottom. So we're good. If we get a warm spell here in late fall, I may come back and do a late harvest because they've got way more here than what they're really going to need for spring, but I don't want to take it from them yet because it's just not dried enough. This one again has quite a bit of wet nectar there. That's the one I wasn't quite sure about. It didn't drip out, but I'm just wary of harvesting that much wet nectar. I will take this one, and I'll take this little one, and move on to the next hive. Next, I'm going to open up Taj Mahive and look at the 2 colonies that are in here. We'll start with Hive 3 because it's fairly small. We should be able to get in and out of that pretty quick. And then we'll look at Hive 1. Hive 3 being a smaller hive, they may be a little more susceptible to robbing. After opening up 2 hives already, I've got a bunch of bees that are flying around here. They seem to be looking for some opportunity to rob from somebody else. So I don't want to keep the hives open any longer than we need to today. So we'll try to get in and out fairly quickly. Like our other hives, looks like this end frame doesn't have a whole lot on it. Little bit of honey there at the top, maybe a little nectar, about half and half, but it's dry on this other side. They got a few hive beetles, and it looks like they kind of have them pushed towards the outside. This next frame has more capped honey on it. We'll see how much. It's nice and heavy. Oh, that is a nice frame. Big percentage of this is all capped. Got a couple beetles in there, and they've got some nectar at the bottom, but the majority of this, at least on that side, now this side is about 50-50. Let's see what we got on the next frame. I would expect as we get in closer to the brood frames, we'd see more frames that are more completely filled and capped. So those may be the ones more likely to harvest. And look at that, we've got almost all completely capped. So that is a lovely frame. I believe we can go ahead and harvest that one. There's another big heavy frame. We got a nice big frame there. I suspect this next frame is going to be our last honey frame before we get into brood. Or we might have brood on here. We got quite a bit of bee bread there, so that may be a good frame for them to cluster on. And if they got bee bread there, they may have some brood on this next frame. Yes, there they got some capped brood on that side, capped brood on this side. So we've got our brood right there. Now let's see what they got on the other end. So this frame was nearly all honey. We may be able to harvest another frame from this hive, but we'll see what they've got on this end towards the wall. We got cap brood on this side, cap brood on this side, and so this end frame should be honey. Mostly all honey on here. This is the one that had about 50-50, and we got a couple frames of honey off of this one, so we'll let them keep that. This last frame, I almost can pull this one out because they're not really using it too much. They have nothing on this side. Because that's about 50-50 on this side, there's just not much to do with that. I'm going to try to remember that that's here. If my resource hive is a little short on what it needs, I may give them that frame. So that kind of does it for this hive. This colony should be good for winter. It shouldn't need to open them up again unless I come back to grab that one end frame for another hive to use. So now we'll get into Hive 1. Hive 1 has been a really booming hive this year. They've got 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 16 frames right now. And just this morning, I was watching the bees at the entrance. The forager bees were coming in so fast that they couldn't get in the entrance fast enough. The entrance is an 1.5 inch circle, and they were piling up at the entrance and falling all over themselves because they just couldn't all get through. So this frame has just a little bit of honey in it and some nectar. I don't think they're going to need this one. I'm going to go ahead and pull this off. Don't know if I'm going to harvest it. It may go to another hive. Next frame, again, kind of like we've seen before, we got some wet nectar. I'd say we're about 60% capped on this one. Not sure I want to harvest that one though. We may just leave it as an extra for them. This one again, we're looking at about 60% cap. I'd rather leave the wet nectar for them to finish up and take away the frames that are all capped or mostly capped. All right, now we're looking at about 70% capped, so that's a possible candidate frame there. And there's a pretty good frame. This is a well, we got some uncapped on this side. For the most part, this one is almost all capped. A little bit around the sides, but they're starting to cap it, which tells me that it's pretty dry. And even on this side, where we have the wet nectar, they're kind of capping through there, you can see them starting to pull caps over the top of those, so I believe we're good with this one. Now that one's kind of odd. It's not capped in the middle, capped at the top and the bottom. So that's kind of unusual. I will probably leave this one for them, but the next one looks very interesting. It's nice and heavy. Almost completely capped on this side. A little less on this side. They've got some wet nectar on this side, but again, they're kind of starting to draw caps over some of that. Got a couple beetles in there, but I think we're good to harvest this one. Oh, she's getting me. Oh, darn it. I have to put some gloves on. They're getting a little testy. Now we're getting, this is mostly uncapped, but they have a good band of honey at the top. So I believe that's probably a brood frame that they have started backfilling. That down here, I'm gonna put some gloves on. See a little fighting here as some bees are trying to rob this. But like I said, this is a very strong hive. If we get a few robbers in here, I don't think this hive is gonna be phased. But I'm still gonna try to be considerate and get through here pretty quickly. Try to be as gentle as I can with these gloves on. And that's again a frame that the middle of it is pretty much all uncapped. I think it's probably they're backfilling a brood frame there. And I think that's probably what we're gonna see from here on in. Yeah, they got some brood on there. These bees are under some robbing pressure here, and because of that they're getting very defensive. I think they've got plenty of stores here. I don't need to go to the other end. We'll just close them up and let them go about their day. Thankfully, the other colonies we have to inspect are kind of in another part of the yard, so we can kind of get away from some of this. So that only got 2 frames out of this hive. That leaves them with more than they really will need for spring. If we get another warm stretch this fall, maybe I'll do a late harvest. This next colony is the first swarm that I caught this spring. They're in a 12 frame hive just because I don't have a larger hive for them right now. I actually have one built, I just need to finish the lid for it, and hoping to get that done and be able to have another warm day to move those bees into that hive for winter. But for now they're in this 12 frame hive that was made from Langstroth boxes, and they've been very active, so we'll see how they're doing and see if they have any honey to give us. But as far as what they got on the frames, they've got plenty of space. We've got this frame that's just a half sheet of foundation, and they've hardly done anything with that, so we'll get that out of there. This next frame has pretty good honey stores. This may be a harvestable frame depending on what else they have. A lot of nice capped honey on there, and there's not really much wet honey in there, so that's pretty much what is on the frame is pretty much capped and good to go. I think that's probably the prettiest frame we've seen so far today. This next frame also appears to be pretty heavy with honey. A little bit of wet nectar in this one, and a little more on this side. But that's a nice full honey frame. We'll see what else they got. And that's also a full nectar frame. Wet nectar at the bottom, capped honey towards the top. And normally I try to work fairly slow and gentle, but the way the bees are today, I don't want to disturb them any more than necessary. So this is all nectar on the side toward me. On this other side it's nectar and bee bread. So that's probably kind of the beginning of our brood frames here. Let's see what we've got in the next frame. Yeah, this is kind of an open frame. We've got some bee bread in there, got some nectar towards the bottom and honey at the top, and then we've got brood on this side. So we got some capped brood here up in this part of the frame. So there's our brood. I'm just going to check and see what we have on the other end. That'll tell us whether we can take this frame or not. Alright, and this is all nectar and about half and half nectar and honey on this side. So we've got our honey frame there. I'm going to guess that this next frame is probably brood. And it certainly is, so a lot of capped brood there. So kind of textbook here. Push these back together. I'm going to squeeze these to kind of seal that propolis. So that gives them 7 frames to overwinter on, which I think is fine. And we'll be able to take this. So we're able to get 2 frames of honey out of this colony, so that's pretty cool. Is that hive up? And on to the last one. So our last hive to inspect today is the under the sea hive, and this is a daughter colony of my original mother colony. These were in the green hive last year, and I split that colony and ended up moving that daughter queen to this colony, and the queen that's in there is a granddaughter or an F2 of the original mother queen. Looks like their numbers are drawing back a little just because they don't have a lot of bees in here. They actually have a drone down in there. That's really surprising. You would think by now they would have chased all the drones out, but he has somehow avoided getting banished. This is a hive that's been extremely busy. They got 3, 6, 9, 11 frames, so not a huge number of frames, but at last check they hadn't outgrown their space. So yeah, and still the case, they've got a frame here on the end that they're working on, but it's not completely filled out. So we've got this frame. It's mostly all honey and nectar. Not sure there's really enough to harvest there. I may just leave that one for them as a matter of course. And this is a hive that went through a comb collapse, and this next frame kind of shows the aftermath of that. That comb kind of slid down to the bottom of that frame, and they're kind of rebuilding. So they've got some nectar at the top, a little bit of it is capped. Down at the bottom they haven't really done much at all with what's left of that collapsed comb. They're working there. They may be storing some nectar in there, but that's kind of an ugly frame. I may pull that one out just for good measure. I'm not seeing as much nectar stored up in here yet as I had in the other hives. I don't know if I should be concerned because they've been so busy at the entrance. I would expect to see more. But okay, so they've got about the top half of this covered with honey and nectar. On this side it's pretty much just nectar, but it's pretty dry. You can see they're starting to cap that. I will be very surprised based on how active this hive has been if we don't get a harvestable frame out of here, but that may be the way it goes. This frame is heavier. It's got a lot of honey at the top, got some bee bread in there. This looks like it's probably a brood frame that they've been backfilling. This frame is mostly nectar. They've got some bee bread in the middle. On this side, some of that nectar towards the middle is capped. On this side, it's pretty much uncapped throughout, but they do have about 5 inches of honey at the top. And now we've got capped brood on that frame. So we're into our brood frames. So obviously we won't be harvesting that. See what we've got on this end. All right, and that is pretty much all honey and nectar. Well, it's all on this side. It's covered with honey and nectar. On the other side there's some nectar towards the bottom, but it's not full, but it's still a pretty good frame. And this frame is about 50-50 honey and nectar. Based on that, I'll let them keep that. Bees figured out the formula, and then I think we're getting back into brood. Yeah, we got some capped brood at the bottom of this frame. So we'll go ahead and close this up, and I'm gonna pull this ugly frame out, and if nothing else, we'll just harvest the wax from it. I may set it out, let the bees feed off of it today. And this one doesn't have much. There's a little bit of harvestable honey on that one. We'll go ahead and pull that. So we got a little bit of honey out of this hive, but they'll have plenty left for themselves going into winter. So that gets us through the hives and finding some frames that we can harvest. I think we got a pretty good quantity. Should have a pretty decent harvest. So now we just got to get the honey out. Extracting honey from Layens frames is basically the same process as from Langstroth frames, at least if you use a rotary extractor, which is what I'm going to be doing in this case. I am removing the wax cappings. I have 2 tools that I'm using to do this. I had the uncapping scraper that I was using that is about 4 inches wide. That works really well if you're working on a large, smooth area of the comb. And then for smaller or irregular areas, I have this smaller fork tool that I use to remove the last bits of the wax cappings. Once the cappings are off, the honey is exposed and the frame is ready to go into the extractor where it will be spun to remove all of the honey. Just like when extracting Langstroth frames, the frames are put into the rotary extractor and spun to remove all of the honey. Some people have complained that the extractor needed for the Layens frames is kind of expensive, but when you consider that the SAF Regatta extractor that I use is the same size as a 9-frame radial extractor for Langstroth frames. In fact, you can swap out the basket with a 9-frame radial basket. When you compare the prices for that extractor against the Layens extractor, it's really pretty comparable. After the frames have been spun on one side, I take them out of the extractor, turn them around to extract the honey from the other side. I do put these frames into the extractor upside down, and the reason for that is that the comb is built by the bees with the cells at an angle down towards the center of the frame. So by turning the frame upside down, now the cells are angled down to the outside of the frame, and so hopefully gravity will help with the extraction. And it doesn't matter what your frame size is or what your extraction method is, It's always a thrill to see that golden sweet honey flowing. If you've enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate if you'd give it a like, and please click the subscribe button so you don't miss the next video. And also go ahead and watch this other video that Google has selected especially for you. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you next time.